I have the privilege of kicking things off for this group. I am Pat Morgan. I will be your moderator for this session. And I would like to start with our first slide and a moment, actually let's do our second slide, and a moment of pause and remembrance. One of our speakers is unable to be with us today because his son was a victim of tragedy. And I'd like to take a moment to remember Karim Abu Najm at UC Davis. And I also want to call out the wonderful, amazing spirit that we as people have, this community has, because although Majdi cannot be with us today, this community pulled together, brought in a new speaker. Thank you to Abby for joining us, and really is helping to drive forward what this conference is all about. The perseverance, looking forward, and working together to build a more sustainable world. So the next slide, please. I want to take just a quick moment and talk about hunger for none and health for all. It's the Bayer model. I work for Bayer Crop Science, and I want to call out a couple of really quick things of why this session is so important to us at Bayer and why I think this is an important topic. Next slide, if you would. So this is got a lot of writing on it, not intended to be read. The big thing I want to call out is that triangle you see in the middle. We have three sustainability portions. Inclusive growth. We want to bring everybody along together. Reduced ecological footprint. Sustainability, a sustainable circular bioeconomy. And acting responsibly along the entire value chain. That's what we're talking about, is going from a linear, one-time use to a circular reuse of all of our resources. And why I want to point out this triangle is that really tiny little font down underneath it, which is, this is more than a corporate lip service that we are making. This is a sustainability commitment that Bayer has made, and they have tied every employee around the globe, their compensation, to meeting these sustainability goals. So every Bayer employee now is based, one of our goals is that. Our compensation is based around hitting those sustainability goals. So it's more than just what we're saying, it's who we are, who our culture is, and what we do. And so from the standpoint of food security, we are making major contributions in the world. We're helping smallholders through price support, making available the best genetics to help in sustainable agriculture. And our goal is to reach over 100 million smallholders in the next 6 years. So this is a large goal. We're going to double the footprint that we have as a corporation in supporting our smallholders. And the last one I'm going to point out, just because it is the Water for Food Conference, is that bubble right in the middle. Last year we made a 4% reduction in our water consumption at our production facilities. So these are goals that we as a company believe in. We put our money where our mouth is, and we really are trying to make an impact in the world, which is what these panelists I have the privilege of introducing will be talking about here at the Water for Food Conference. So with that, I'd like to bring up Abby Engelberth and have her speak on some stuff. We'll go with that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Abby Engelberth. I'm an associate professor at Purdue University in Ag and Biological Engineering. I want to thank you all for allowing me to come and fill in and talk with you all today. And I hope that my talk is able to fit in nicely with what the things you guys are doing. It's not directly related to water, but as we all know, you kind of need water to grow food. So I want to talk a little bit about what the definitions are. So what is food waste? It is a low quality material that would cost more to dispose of, or it would cost more to transport and treat than to simply discard. Most of our food waste comes from residential and restaurants, so cafeterias, traditional restaurants, things like that. And only about 5% is from what we would say industrial sources. There are about 38.4 million tons of food waste produced in the U.S., and that was in 2014. That number, of course, has grown. Some of these values are hard to get a hold of, so as soon as we have one, we kind of glom onto it. Talk a little bit about some other terminology. So there's also food waste versus food loss. So we can think of food waste as being the plate waste, spoiled foods, peels, rinds, things that are considered inedible. Food loss is oftentimes things that are lost along the way, unharvested crops, things like that. So kind of thinking about these two different things. They're often used interchangeably. So if you're reading any of the literature, you might see food waste used as food lost and vice versa. But if we think about food loss, it is kind of one of those things that we want to get after because it happens at every step along the supply chain. So from distribution, harvesting, production, all of that, there's some portion of food that is lost along the way. It's point sourced, but it's generally fairly homogeneous, and that's what we think of as the industrial or the processed food waste. So that 5% is small, but it's easier in some ways to get to. If we do not do anything with this, there are current disposal strategies, one being landfilling, which about 29 million tons of food waste were sent to landfill in 2014. This is really difficult to handle organic matter. Many greenhouse gases, et cetera, are produced from the decomposition, so it's not great to just throw in landfill, contributes to global warming. The other possibility that happens with it is incinerated. It's relatively inexpensive. You can get heat recovery, power, things like that from the incineration process. There is negative environmental impacts due to the gases that are released. Also, it's generally fairly high in water content, so it does take some more energy to dispose of it in that way. Also, when it is disposed of, there are greenhouse gases that are released. In 2017, about 14.1% of methane emissions from landfills were from food waste. And if there was a study performed that if we diverted the food waste from the landfills and did something of higher value with it, we could take off the equivalent of 1 out of every 5 vehicles off the road. So by doing something with the food waste, we were able to reduce the carbon dioxide and methane production in the world. But not only are we thinking about just those types of things that are being diverted, when we waste food, there's a lot more that goes into it. So anything from the processing, the transport, the harvest, all of those processes and labor that went into it are also being wasted. So when we throw food in the trash, we're throwing away a lot more than just food. So we want to think about what can we do to add some value. So we can think about upgrading the food waste. So food is produced, it is usually gone through one of 3 distribution routes, either to households, to the food service industry, or industrial process, and then to households and the food service industry. These are, oftentimes we have some high value wastes that we can take and use in some way, take it through a valorization process. And the 2 ways we're going to look at more succinctly today are either anaerobic digestion or some type of a downstream processing to make a specialty chemical or some type of a high value product. From those, there's usually some type of a very small amount of low value waste that is then landfilled. There's also composting, but that's not something we necessarily do at the industrial level. That's usually much more household related. So why do we want to target industrial food waste? And this is just the initial targets for what we're doing. One, it's a lot easier to collect. So it's point source in production, so we don't have to collect from a lot of highly distributed, widely distributed wastes. It's fairly constant in composition and volume, so you know exactly what you're going to get and you know what it's going to be made of. The potential for conversion to a high value product is much higher because it is homogeneous and you do know what you're dealing with. And it then also creates a demand for inedible, spoiled, or unattractive foods. There's also companies out there that are now, I think there's one called Ugly Fruit. And so you can buy those unattractive fruits that people don't want to necessarily have for sale in the grocery store. But that's not what we're targeting. So we're really looking at those bigger volumes of homogeneous waste that we can do something with. So we're going to look at the 2 different routes, kind of looking at specialty products and heat and power. I have just one case study to look at today, otherwise we'd be here all day and no one wants to do that, well, at least not listening to me. So we're going to look at lactic acid. So the market for lactic acid is on the rise. It is a precursor or a building block chemical for polylactic acid, which I'm sure you've seen that all over the place. A lot of the biodegradable not silverware, like flatware that you get from restaurants and things like that. A lot of that is PLA these days. They also make the plastic spools that they use in those printers. Those 3D printers are made from PLA as well. So there is a high demand for it, and you can make it from basically any carbon-rich resource. There has been studies that have used lactic acid made from potato peels. So about 60% of the tomatoes that are made and processed are made into foods that don't require the peels. So there's a lot of peels. We need something to do with it. So we can take those peels, they're high in starch. You can use a microbial fermentation to produce lactate. You can also use wastewater sludge as the inoculum and get fairly optically pure lactic acid that can then be upgraded into polylactic acid. In my group, we wanted to see what it would be like to use a food waste to do this and optimize the process. So there were groups that looked at food waste only, and we looked at food waste co-digested with anaerobic digestion sludge, so that we could see what that would do for the lactic acid production. We were able to find that there was a trade-off between yield and concentration depending on the solids loading rate. And the big goal for what we were trying to do was, because it is a mixed microbial community, it's a little bit difficult to get optically pure, and the optically pure is what you need for the polylactic acid, but we were able to find that we could get a fairly optically pure that could take some further processing to get a lactic acid that is usable. So this is a study that definitely has potential for the future, and you can use food waste, and we actually used the food waste produced at the Purdue dining courts with the sludge from the wastewater treatment in town to produce this. Looking at the other side of things, the heat and power, you can use anaerobic digestion using a variety of feedstocks, food waste, organic matter, manure, combined, separate, either way. You can get a biogas or a digestate. The nice thing about anaerobic digestion, it is fairly robust, it is fairly easy to operate, and you do get a variety of byproducts along with the main product of methane. So there's a lot to do here. It's just generally not a high value, but it can use the high volume that is produced. So there's a lot of anaerobic digestion throughout the United States. We have a little over 2,000 sites producing biogas. About 250 of those are on farms. A little over 1,000 of them are at wastewater recovery or recycling facilities. There's standalone systems that use just food waste. There's a lot of these going on. But in comparison, Europe has over 10,000 anaerobic digesters in operation. So we are still far behind on this technology, but there is room to improve some of that. Looking at the facilities we have about 68 standalone digesters. They have a reported capacity of over 20 million tons per year. In 2018, we only used about 8 million. Not saying we need more food waste just to meet this capacity, just saying we have more capacity to handle some more of these things. So there is capacity to look at some of the food waste and upgrade it within the facilities that we currently have. There was a study in 2007 looking at food waste going into anaerobic digesters, and it was a hodgepodge of stuff. Over a year they looked at stuff, so everything from organics, plastics, bones, shells, fabrics, all that stuff going into the digester. They found that the big takeaway message from this is that the system is very stable despite all of the fluctuations in the organics loading. So anaerobic digestion is a viable way to upgrade a lot of organic matter, and it doesn't necessarily depend on a homogeneous feedstock. And just as a small look at valorization potential, so this is looking at just everything's perfect comparison. If we could take everything that comes out and perfectly convert it into a product, being either a specialty revenue product, and these are a lot of different potential things out there, or just looking at converting it into methane and how much revenue could be gained from that. We find that the potential revenue from a specialty product is much, much higher, but that's because these specialty products have a high value. However, the processes that are involved to produce them are going to be a lot more specialized and need a lot more attention. But the big problem with some of these things is that when most people look at upgrading a lot of this stuff, there's no economics attached to it. So there's a lot of, well, we could do this, and that's about it. So we want to look at what are the economic potentials and what would actually be required to make some of these processes put into place. So I'm looking at kind of the combining of the specialty products with the heat and power. I looked at, and you can see there's a link to, or a picture of a paper that I put out a few years ago, looking specifically at what would it take, or what are the driving factors in the economics of upgrading some of these waste streams, these industrial waste streams. And it was really, really hard to find any papers that had similar economics involved. So there's not a lot of standard metrics that are used with techno-economic analyses. But from what I could find, and of pretty thorough analysis, facility capacity and size are the biggest driving factors. Selling price of the product is a driving factor, and the portfolio of products. So we need something that is going to be able to take in a lot of things and make a lot of different stuff. And this kind of leads into the biorefractory concept. So we have a carbon-rich biological material going into some type of facility, making a variety of products that can then be consumed and used, and the carbon is able then to cycle through the system. So that is kind of the major concept that we need to, moving forward, kind of work towards, is that biorefinery, aka biorefractory. The next step for this, there are really some complex solutions are needed. So if we're going to tackle anything besides, especially industrial food waste sources, anything residential, I think collection and transportation are going to be the biggest hurdles. There's a lot of education that will be involved in taking this. There's also a need for buy-in from producers, consumers, and different communities. Municipalities are going to have to get on board with this stuff. And as we heard this morning, public education and public involvement are absolutely necessary to move any of these types of things forward. As a reminder, just landfilling is the very last option. I was happy to see at this meeting that there are, the waste bins do have an option for composting to put your organic materials in. I think that's fantastic. The biggest thing, of course, is reducing what we consume and what we buy, and the last option is landfilling. So the big takeaway is food waste is inevitable. We're going to lose some of it. We can't eat all parts of the plant. Maybe we can, hang out with some animals that can. Industrial food waste is generally a good target to go after initially because it's homogeneous, it's easy to collect, and as we move forward, looking at anything at the facility size and product portfolio are going to be some of the most important driving factors for viability. And I just want to end with this. This is not a new concept. This is posters from the early 20th century from the USDA saying how food waste is always kind of been an issue, and that we do need to be smart about what we buy and what we consume and how and when we consume it. So thank you all.
Thank you. And it was almost like that was planned, segueing from the USDA signs of the 1920s to Sherry Spiegel, who is with the USDA ARS.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat, and thank you so much to the conference organizers. This has been a fantastic meeting, and I've learned a lot. And thank you, Tala, for inviting me to come speak today. Very happy to be with you all. I'm a rangeland management specialist from Las Cruces, New Mexico. They're in southern New Mexico. I'm with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Research Service at the Jornada Experimental Range. Our unit is part of the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network, otherwise known as LTAR. Who's heard of LTAR before? Anyone? All right, we got some numbers. That's good. Okay, now you have. So this is a group of, it's a network of 18 sites across the country, and with partnerships in Canada and Mexico and in South America. And we're evaluating strategies for local agricultural sustainability under an umbrella of national data and knowledge sharing and knowledge co-production. And the LTAR network is certainly interested in circular bioeconomies, as is much of the rest of the world, so increasingly so. So on the left, we have the vision for a circular bioeconomy by King Charles III, and his vision there includes society and and the roles of society in there. And then on the top right with that small pink circle, he has a circle about biomass, bioprocessing. Over on the right is a figure that gets into more detail. This is from Nature Food about biomass, bioprocessing. Today I'll be in that bottom half of that right diagram, in the slice of the pie that I'm talking about. More has to do with nutrient circularity, and Abby already set the stage really well for this. So one definition of nutrient circularity is recovering nutrients from manures and post-harvest byproducts and using them for further agricultural production. So some of the ways we can do this is substitute food co-products and wastes for conventional animal feed. So Abby didn't touch on animal feeds, but I think it's in there, yeah. And then substituting manures or biosolids, which is human waste, for commercial fertilizers, or both. And so today I'm even drilling down farther, looking specifically at manures and substituting those for commercial fertilizers and some of the opportunities and constraints and the barriers and how we might think about lowering some of those barriers. So why is this important? Well, fertilizer is important to think about. So fertilizer is one of the reasons to think about nutrient circularity. So fertilizer has been a game changer for the entire world and has increased agricultural production many fold and has made people's lives better. It's also, at this point, it's getting risky in certain ways. So the rock that is used to make phosphorus fertilizer is a finite resource, and so if we keep mining it at the same rates and don't find any new major stores, we could run out of phosphorus rock in as soon as 100 years, as many as 300. The models are different, and a lot depends on what we find. There's increasing concerns about environmental impacts from the species of nitrogen that goes into fertilizers, and so the nitrogen can be the wild child of the periodic table. It's hard to really pin down. A lot of it is lost. Galen will tell us about that in his talk. And also these species of nitrogen can contribute to pollution that we all care about. So can phosphorus fertilizers. And then, as we've been reminded recently, fertilizer really is part of global markets, and so as those get more volatile, so do fertilizer prices and eventually food prices. Another reason to think about nutrient circularity with regard to manure and why this might be important is that while we're kind of working with this specter of fertilizer scarcity, we're also dealing with a situation where we have highly concentrated manure in highly concentrated places, and this is due to these broad economic forces of agricultural specialization and concentration that have really split apart crops and livestock in the US and other nations, where it turns out that the livestock production is happening, or the confined livestock production is happening in certain places. It's separated from crops. And so farmers are really responsible for managing these major stores of manure, which can both be liabilities but also major benefits. And so on the liability front, these concentrated stores of manure can result in impacts on air quality and quality of life, as well as pollution of aquatic ecosystems if not managed, with great care. But at the same time, we also have a great opportunity here. So conducting nutrient circularity with manure and substituting manure for fertilizer resources can help improve soil quality, which in turn can reduce losses of nutrients to water, which I know many of us in this room care about. Water quality can also improve water quantity. So there's an excellent opportunity here. But it's so it's great in theory, but highly complex and complicated in practice. And that's why when we think about nutrient circularity and kind of the circular bioeconomy in general, we at the Agricultural Research Service find it to be a good idea to kind of chunk it out by industry types and really understand the industries and how they work, and think about barriers and opportunities in that context. So today I'll be focusing on the beef industry. And so here are 5 major components of beef supply chain. So in the US and Mexico and Canada, a lot looks like this. So it goes from cow-calf operations where, well, maybe less so in Mexico, sorry, I'm digressing. But so cow-calf operations, the cow produces 1 calf each year. That calf gets pushed to the next phase of the supply chain, often to a stocker operation, which is more intensive pasture, and they put on weight gains there, or it might be wheat pasture or grass. Then to feedlots for grain finishing, onto processing and packing, and then marketing. And of course, there is interest in grass finishing, so maintaining the cattle, keeping them out of the feedlots, but that is not catching fire quite yet, but there's a lot of interest in that. And so another important part of this supply chain and thinking about nutrient circularity are the inputs, the biomass inputs that go into each phase of the supply chain. So early in the supply chain, we have a lot of hay in these cow-calf operations on range and pasture. With the stocker operations, hay and wheat, and then in feedlots, hay and corn and other grains, and potentially some byproducts. But some food waste byproducts and other things. But yeah, and I'll say there's grass at which is really important for cow-calf and stocker operations. Another important part of this supply chain or value chain is that the manure is concentrated in the built environment of feedlots. So of course, cattle are going to excrete manure at every phase of the supply chain, but it really gets concentrated in the built environment of feedlots. And so we're looking into these opportunities to potentially use these manure nutrients, the surplus manure nutrients from the feedlots, to fertilize or to add nutrients to grow the inputs into the beef that go into the beef supply chain. So we're looking at opportunities with the corn that goes into feedlots, the wheat and hay that goes into stocker operations, and also the hay that goes into the cow-calf operations. So this is our kind of vision for nutrient circularity. However, again, sounds like a great idea, but it's great in theory, complicated in practice. And that is because the beef industry in the US and Canada, they're really extensive. The links in the supply chain can be really far from each other. So this map shows, so in blue, those are counties or municipalities in Canada where there's cows. It's the number of cows on farms that are grazing on range or pasture, and then those brown lines around the blue show counties or geographic units where hay is a dominant crop. So we have hay and cows pretty much spread everywhere, but the feedlots are concentrated due to this concentration and specialization, and really the efficiencies, the amazing efficiencies of US and Canadian agriculture. So the feedlots are really concentrated more in the middle of the country and then up in southern Alberta. So we see these geographic distances. And so what this kind of phenomenon results in when we have regions that are connected by flows of any type, really, of information or resources, and in this case, commodities, it results in a situation known as telecoupling, so where regions are connected to each other through these flows. So what happens in the social ecological system of one region affects what happens in the other. So I'll give an example from the Southwest where I live. So in that yellow blob down there, so we have a good number, thank you, of cow-calf ranches, and most of our cattle are exported to the Texas High Plains. The calves from those cow-calf operations are exported to the Texas High Plains for grain finishing, and the corn is actually imported by train down to the Texas High Plains from that green region right there. And so there are flows of these resources, there's money exchanged. And so this is a system set up, it's somewhat well described, maybe not in terms of telecoupling, but because of these linkages, you could see like maybe we would backhaul some manure, back to the upper Midwest or back to the Southwest to feed some of that hay that feeds the cattle that go to the feedlots in the Texas High Plains. So this is, this is great, but there are a lot of questions. So, what are the economic costs? What are the environmental costs? And who are the winners and losers if we think about this more extensive manure transport? And so lots of questions about manure, lots of opportunities and constraints. And so we in the Long-Term Agro-Ecosystem Research Network are really building this platform. It's kind of a conceptual platform called the manure shed. So a manure shed is the lands that are connected to an animal feeding operation where manure nutrients from that feeding operation can be applied to meet to environmental, social, and economic goals. And so this is kind of a big kind of program that we're building up in our network of 18 sites. So you can manure sheds do happen, and they can be managed on multiple scales. So we can think about neighborhood scale manure sheds on the top diagram there, although that looks more like a region due to just mapping distortion. And then, so you can go from the neighborhood to the region to trans-regional. You can, even on a farm, you can consider that a manure shed. Where is the manure recycled on the farm? And that's a nutrient management plan for a farm. But so in these neighborhood manure sheds, what we see often is that the manure nutrients go on any crop in the vicinity, and we're looking more at this. Today I'll be talking more about this trans-regional manure shed where it's really more circular, and those nutrients are going back to cattle feed or feed specifically for that industry and the specific animals that came from the progeny of the animals that came from the feedlots where the manure is coming from. So what we did here, we did an analysis published, I guess, last year, looking at 3 hay grazing landscapes where hay and cattle grazing on extensive land is co-located. And so we looked at the hay grazing landscape of Western Canada, which is huge, New Mexico, and Florida. And so this is where there's a lot of grazing land production, a lot of hay production, and then some potential to substitute manure for commercial fertilizer on hay fields. And so we worked pretty hard to develop 4 data sets, and so the first one is we calculated the amount of hay that is actually consumed by grazing cattle in those 3 hay grazing landscapes, so in Florida, New Mexico, Western Canada. We then calculated the nutrient removal by the hay, or what the hay that was fed to those cattle, so how much is actually removed, but then you can also make some assumptions about fertilizer, although you need to know a lot more from producers about what's actually happening with the fertilizer. We got local and state and federal data sets to understand the beef export, the number of cattle being exported from each hay grazing landscape to feedlots, and then the amount of feedlot manure produced in the feedlots that is available for transport back to the hay grazing landscape, so you can start to see the circular. Here it is on a map, so we see our 3 hay grazing landscapes in green, and then the big orange dots are the feedlot destinations, the top 5 feedlot destinations. So starting to get a sense of how far the cattle travel, the calves travel to those feedlots, or the stockers travel to those feedlots, and how far the manure would have to travel back in a hypothetical future agri-food system. So we found that the manure from the feedlots could replace 12% of the nitrogen in fertilizer, 36% of the phosphorus in New Mexico, 37% of the nitrogen, and 34% of the phosphorus in Florida. This is all going to hay, again, in those systems. And then only 3% of nitrogen and 6% of phosphorus. And this has to do with the different time on, so in Canada, cattle are on feed for a shorter time, and there's just like a ton of hay to be fed there with nutrients, so that's why the order of magnitude is different. But then looking at the distances, the shortest distance back was in New Mexico, so on average we had 647 kilometers of travel. I'm out of time, almost done. It's great. So, and then there's a lot more distance to cover for the other 2 hay grazing systems. So This, again, seems like a plausible thing that we might want to plan for in a future agri-food system with more circularity involved, but we also know that in the current agri-food system, manure doesn't travel very far. So this is some results from a survey that our colleague Gwender Meredith, who works here, did. She interviewed manure managers at the top 20 feedlots in the US, and we found that the resource doesn't travel very far, maybe 10 miles, maybe 20 kilometers, not very far. So given that we know that there's this opportunity for this extensive circular management, but that the reality is that it's more neighborhood scale of management, we're starting to ask questions about what are the trade-offs of both of these, what are the impacts of both of these management approaches, and then what are the trade-offs. So we're looking at land and water health, air health, well-being for both the individual and the community, economics, and then productivity. And so these are question marks, and this is our next phase. I would go through an example, but I don't have time, Pat. Sorry. And Galen, I'm sorry to you. But so even if we did find that the trans-regional redistribution is optimal, you know, as you'll hear in all of our talks today, we're going to need some new incentives and structures to make a circular bioeconomy a reality. We're talking in terms of manure auction platforms, consumer awareness for niche marketing, maybe for like a water-friendly beef product if the beef was involved in manure shed management, although we heard yesterday that the clean market signal is not yet there, according to Land O'Lakes. Ecosystem service market incentives. And with that, I just want to say we all live in a manure shed, and I put my email address up there, so please feel free to contact me. I'd love to connect further. So thank you for your time. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. Next up, we have Galen Erickson from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
Thank you, Pat, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm gonna, I guess, build on some of what Sherry's discussed, and maybe delve into a little more detail on nitrogen and greenhouse gases. But really, this can be applied to any nutrients. But I do think the form of those nutrients matter. But we've also got interest in water. As Sherry alluded to, nitrogen fertilizer, which is sort of the Haber-Bosch, right, discovery, has really allowed agriculture to thrive and food production to thrive and feed people. But this is very linear, right? It's a straight line across. And even back in the early 2000s, there was discussion that if you're a vegetarian, 14% of the 100 pounds you start with of nitrogen input gets in your mouth. And so there's losses all the way through. And again, the form of those losses matter, and we'll delve into that a little bit. In other words, it matters if it's ammonia, it matters if it's N2O, which is a potent greenhouse gas, et cetera. But we're not very good at trapping that nitrogen through the system. That's if you're a vegetarian. Obviously, it's less even if you are like me and consume beef as a product. And so my goal early in my career was to make the 4 into 14. I think our goal is shifting to where let's make that, instead of 14, 50, 75. In other words, let's trap those losses, decrease those losses, improve how it's recycled. There's a host of opportunities, and it affects everything from cropping through animal production. I think I've seen a lot of circular bioeconomy figures, and I'm not trying to add to those. A student made this, so I felt obligated to put it in my talk. But circularity is just a circle, right? But it matters, what are those components? I put this on here. It's very similar in concept to what Sherry presented, but I mainly put it on here to illustrate that I'm going to focus somewhat like what Sherry did on this managed intensive system of feeding cattle and managed manure and crop inputs that go back into those systems. That doesn't mean the other components aren't important, doesn't mean that there can't be improvements in those other components, but in many ways, those extensive systems, to be frank, at least based on measurements from LTA and others, are pretty good at recycling nutrients now. So I believe one of the benefits of evaluating things now in this more circularity concept is knowing where are their gaps, what are the biggest options for improvement. We're pushing that the part I've outlined in the square is where we think the biggest opportunity is currently. Doesn't mean there can't be improvements in other spaces. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a few things. I'm going to focus a little bit of data on greenhouse gases. Everybody wants to present that on CO2 equivalents because greenhouse gases are either CO2, methane, or N2O, and there's different potency. I do think nitrogen's probably best place to start with evaluating nutrient circularity, and again, form of nitrogen matters. Others, Ahmed and UNL are going to be focused on economics associated with this process. I won't touch on that. And then I didn't put water on there and realized this morning I should add the fourth bullet point. But my point is water, I believe, because we've done some things looking at green, blue, and gray water relative to the beef complex. Beef is a big water user. 98% of it's in feed inputs, and 75% of that's green water. And if you know what that means, then you know that that's not something that we can really improve on, at least relative to productivity. Okay, so I'm going to switch then and start with feed inputs. And so this really delves into the fertilizer standpoint. And again, I think I'm going to be picking on fertilizer a bit, but recognize that without fertilizer synthesis and use, we wouldn't be feeding the number of people we are today. But I'm still going to pick on it because I think we can improve how we trap that nitrogen. The nitrogen fertilizer is actually one of the greatest CO2 or greenhouse gas inputs into corn production from an energy balance standpoint. And it ties back into that circularity where if I can recycle nitrogen and never lost it, you automatically drop those nitrogen fertilizer inputs that you need to put back in. So this has been studied. This is an example from 2016 looking at the carbon footprint, CFP is what they called it, of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of product. So for urea fertilizer, that's the 1.18 urea ammonium nitrate and NPK and so on. So we know, or at least have measured and associated what's the greenhouse gas intensity of nitrogen fertilizer for crop inputs. Some work from Nebraska, the Dudley reference, if you express that on a kilogram of weight basis for cattle, we've come up with 0.7 kilos of CO2 equivalents is the feed inputs to make a beef finished animal. So down at the bottom is how much per head per year, and you can see that I just put alfalfa on there. We feed a little bit of forage in the grain finishing system and a lot of grain and byproducts. And so the corn and distillers grains production, if you're not familiar with those, make sure you go on the tour on Thursday. I'll be involved some with our stop at Joel Weber's. You'll see a lot of distillers grains being fed. But clearly, for Nebraska, we have a lot of corn production, which is really important to our state, a lot of distillers grains, which is a byproduct out of the ethanol plants that we don't want to landfill. We certainly want to feed back to cattle. They actually do well on it, do better on it. And then we have a lot of beef cattle that can utilize those, and I think we can recycle our manure in this state, and then we can worry about doing that in other places. But the majority of our inputs from a feed standpoint is grain and grain byproducts. Now, switching to the feedlot phase, I think that we have measured the different components of the beef complex and how much greenhouse gases are produced in those different components. But we've never looked at what is the opportunities to improve on that, and particularly we've never really looked at it in a circular manner when we start looking at ways to recycle those. So I'm going to touch on understanding the greenhouse gas balance. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on nitrogen use efficiency because that's where I think UNL is going to be focused in the near future. And happy to talk with others if there's questions about greenhouse gases. And again, like I said, I won't touch on economics. I just got to point out that, Sherry, this picture on the bottom is a graduate student. Her name was Annie Dorr, did her master's degree. That's 10 years old. And she was really proud of the value she had in that bag of manure she was sampling. You can see she's even showing it off. The point is, we've done a lot of manure work. Obviously, it takes unique students that want to be playing in manure. So we've done a lot of work in our feedlot systems, typical here of Nebraska. We're blessed with a research facility that some of you may visit tomorrow. We do nutrient flows through that system. So that's just pictures. We measure the amount of water that runs off of those pens and the nutrient content of those, and then obviously harvest that manure. Recently, before Dr. Rick Kelsch retired, he helped us summarize 20 years of information collected year-round, so a winter feeding period and a summer feeding period, and this is our summary. And there's a lot of diverse diets. So first off, my background, and if I have any expertise, is in nutrition of cattle, so how we feed them and diet formulation. We can manipulate diets quite a bit. So how much nitrogen we put in the diet, which has impacts on performance, and then obviously manure. So this is across just diverse diets, but it shows what happens in the summer and what happens in the wintertime. The key is in the red. So we've measured how much nitrogen went into them, how much stayed in the cattle, how much they excrete. Unfortunately, most of what we feed gets excreted. So you can see in the summertime, they're excreting 211 grams per steer per day. And we lost 154, 73% of that on average across 20 years of continuous data. In the wintertime, it's much better. We only lose 50%, which is still bad. I believe nitrogen losses from agriculture, and particularly ammonia losses, is our biggest challenge going forward. Obviously, water is too, but I think this is where we have a great opportunity. And by the way, we will improve our nitrogen use efficiency if I can cut that to zero and make manure better fertilizer. Phosphorus, similar story, although I'm probably less concerned because it's not quite as reactive and easy to lose, even though it is important to monitor. Okay, so I want to lastly end within the feedlot. What we're going to be doing at UNL in the future is looking at different ways of managing manure in different housing systems. I just want to point out, everybody can say, well, why don't we just feed cattle or any ant livestock and just harvest the manure fresh and take it out and put it into crop acres and get it used well. Get that transferred out, 10 miles, whatever. Okay, today's not a good day to be scraping pens because it's raining out. Can't do that. And the best time to scrape pens in Nebraska and haul it out is in August, which is not a good time to be applying it to crop acres. So what do you do every other time of the year? You have to stockpile or store it. Composting is also another it requires intensive management. Sounds like it's a good solution. I'll challenge that here in a minute, at least for feedlots. And then we have other types of housing systems in the bottom right where cattle are in barns and we can collect manure and have it in liquid form, and it's a great fertilizer, but it's a more expensive housing system. I just put this up here. This is a study done by Luby. I didn't have the reference on there. And then green is stockpiled manure. The greenish bars and the gray bars are composted manure. We composted for around 10 years and quantified the costs and looked at the nutrient recovery. And frankly, you lose more nitrogen by composting. It is more stable, but if you can utilize fresh or stockpiled manure, it is actually better from a nutrient conservation standpoint. And that's not something just we've seen. That's been well established in the literature. Okay, the last thing I think we know is we know how much greenhouse gases come from manure. This is a study actually from Nebraska, as well as another reference, Boren in 2011, where we quantified methane, CO2, and nitrous oxide from different parts of the manure process, either while it's in the pen, composting, and holding pond. That's the runoff ponds. Just to put that in perspective, cattle naturally per day produce about 125 to 200 grams a day of methane enterically. That's being worked on. We're going to eventually cut that in half, I believe, or more. But you can see those numbers are all quite small compared to what cattle naturally produce out of their mouth every day in terms of methane and CO2. Last thing then, I think for the feedlot phase is Al Rotz, who Sherry referenced in some of her work and some work from Nebraska. I think we know the greenhouse gas balances and the amount of ammonia produced on either a per unit of meat basis or per unit per day, per animal, et cetera. So I think we understand a lot about how cattle produce and release in our systems CO2 and greenhouse gases and ammonia. But what we haven't done is we haven't tied that back to offset fertilizer, and I don't think we've tied that back. So I'm not going to go through these. This is just, in fact, I wanted to skip it, but it shows what the N2O emissions are for, and it's variable. So what I think we have to do is every one of us have been studying bits and pieces of this circle and figuring out ways to manipulate it. Not many of us have been able to put the whole system together. That's what we hope to change here at UNL in the future. So we're going to be focused on more nitrogen and phosphorus balance, but now instead of just showing you the balance through the feedlot, I'm going to start with fertilizer use at the crop area, through the feedlot and back and recycled through. And not just mass, but what are the forms of those? So even if I measure greenhouse gases, many places measure CO2 and methane, but they don't measure N2O, which is incomplete then. So I think we need to have complete greenhouse gas balances. And then once we do those things, we can start manipulating it. What's the impact of using distillers grains or not? What are some other emerging feeds? There are going to be inhibitors that can be fed, meaning chemicals, right? We got to be willing to accept those if they have huge improvements in this process. Lastly, we are investing roughly $7 million, over half of that's from private donors, in a new feedlot system at our Eastern Nebraska Research Extension Education Center. Very excited about that. It's a 10,000 acre facility. We will have 4 different housing systems. We also measure a lot of greenhouse gases. So this is just a schematic. It's about half built, and hopefully the other half gets built throughout the rest of the year. With that, I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Galen. And as our last speaker makes his way up here, I do want to let everyone know we will be having a panel discussion following our last speaker. So prepare your questions. We'll be taking those both in the room and online. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ahmed Shenek from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming. I will be talking about the economics of circular economy. And this work is in collaboration with Dr. Constantinos Yanakas and Tala Awada. The global economic system is characterized by a linear, linear, where we take raw material and energy resources. We extract raw material, energy resources, process, then apply to the different economic activities of production and consumption. Then we produce waste. This waste is discarded into the environment. And research showed that only 6% of our global economy is circular, and half of the linear flow enters the economy and leaves within a year. And why the linear economic system has been key for the global economic growth and prosperity, as shown by the GDP growth over the year, it has placed enormous pressure on humanity as we are facing a complex challenge brought on us by food, the need for increased food, feed, fuel, and bioenergy production, climate change, and by 2015, it is estimated that our food production would need to increase by 70% to meet the current population growth. And another framing of this piece of information is that by 2050, we need 1.7 Earth. And the greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise globally, and we are still not reducing our greenhouse gas emission fast enough to avoid warming that will be greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius and possibly 2 in the coming decade. It is evident that the linear economic system needs a fundamental transformation if we are to ensure a long-term sustainable development and mitigate climate change and meet the societal and the environmental need. And in this context, the concept of circular economy has received an increased attention as an alternative paradigm to replace the linear economic system. And the question, what is circular economy? So the circular economy is defined as is an integrated economic and technical system that is designed to maximize the value and minimize the negative environmental impacts by closing the loop and extending the life cycle of manufactured and natural capital circulation in the economy. And recognizing the importance of circular economy, the literature, the relevant literature with respect to these concepts there is no agreement on the definition and the understanding of these concepts. I have here two of the most used definition, and I'm not going to read the definition, but all the definition of circular economy focus on method and process that facilitate the transition to circular economy. And as I said, they focus on the technical and the engineering approach. And as a result, circular supply chain are rare. So the conclusion from this literature is while the development of processes and methods to facilitate the transition to circular economy is certainly necessary, is not sufficient for the adoption of circular economy, because for all the interest group, if circular economy is not beneficial or profitable, they might not adopt it in practice. So the objective of this research is to emphasize the need for the study of economics of the circular economy, and we are developing a general framework that illustrates the transition from linear to a circular system, and we are going to discuss some economic and policy issues that arise when we are transitioning from linear to circular economy. And here the general framework that we are developed. So there are three colors: green, black, and blue. Green represents the environment, and black represents a linear supply chain consisting of producer, processor, retailer, and consumer. And blue is when this linear supply chain becomes circular. And if we just in the first, I will just go for one. I'm not going to go through the whole supply chain, but I will start by producer one. For example, producer one in black use two types of input: manufactured capital and natural capital to produce output Y1 that goes to the next stage to the processor. But in addition to this output, producer one produce byproducts and waste. That under the linear supply chain, these byproducts and waste goes to the environment. And the production process entails also the production of an undesirable output, which is Y1U, that goes to the environment. And this can be CO2 emission and water acidification and all the negative impacts associated with production or transportation and so on. And the same thing happened for the same process applied for producer 2, processor 1, until we go to the final stage, consumer. And we introduce circularity in blue by establishing circular economy units at each stage of the supply chain. And for example, for producer at the production stage, there is circular economy unit 1 in blue that take byproducts and waste that is produced at this stage, collected and treated, and produce a recycled capital that goes back to the production system, and other recycled capital that go to other supply chain, and some of the byproducts and waste cannot be fully recovered. Some of it go in the form of Z to the environment. And the advantage of this framework is when it can be easy, we can apply it easy to scale up the circular economy. For example, producer one can represent one specific, in the context of the agri-food supply chain, the producer one can be, for example, a crop production, and the producer two can represent livestock production, and the waste, for example, at the livestock production, as was presented in the previous presentation, can be manure. So the circular economy will take the manure and treat it, and it go back, for example, to producer one as an input. And some of the waste from producer one, in the case of a crop production, biomass, for example, can be collected and treated and go to producer two, for example, biomass, and used as an input for livestock production. And this framework also can be used to provide circularity metric by comparing, for example, the mitigation in the negative environmental impact by comparing the different parameters, and for example, the ratio of the total waste at a given stage, the difference between the ratio of the waste and byproduct that goes to the environment versus the one that is collected can give a circularity, a metric for measuring circularity at that specific stage. And some of the economic issue is that the introduction of circularity can affect the production function, and in this context, for example, the recovery and the treatment of waste that's become an input to the production function. So what's happened is we increase the set of inputs available to producer, which will affect the production function and the technology of the producer. And the impacts of introducing circularity depend on the relationship between the production function under the linear and the circular supply chain, then the relationship between the recovered inputs or the recycled capital with the traditional one, and in the context of agri-food supply, for example, the substitution between, for example, recycled manure with manufactured fertilizer will define the circularity at that stage. And it also affects, since it affects input and production function, it affects the cost of production. If it's cheaper to produce recycled capital, then we can make some cost saving, and the cheaper these secondary inputs, the higher are the cost saving. And establishing circular units at each stage is costly. There are fixed costs and variable costs associated with the establishing circularity at each stage. And the market structure, the high are the fixed costs, it is more likely that we will have a very concentrated market. And another relevant point is consumer preferences for products that's being produced under circular supply chain. For example, consumer perceived quality about products that waste was part of the production process, and how consumers respond to that affect is translated to demand, then it will affect the adoption of circular practice. And the rebound effect in the energy literature, there is something called the rebound effect, where due to, for example, if in the context of circular economy, if we become efficient, then we realize some saving. That saving can go to other production and other supply chain, which can result in more extraction of primary primary input, which will have a negative impact on the environment. And all of this lead to an uncertainty about the economic impacts of increased circularity. And there are additional revenue associated with waste and byproducts, those circular economy units through sales of recycled outputs, they create revenues. This is another important factor. And because consumers care about the social and environmental attributes and they are willing to pay more, so how firms manage that is another relevant important. So the policy implication are derived from those economic issues. So those economic issues, there are two factors: the expected benefits from circularity and versus the expected cost, which will the relationship between these two factors determine the adoption of circularity. If the expected benefits equal to the expected cost, then circularity will be adopted, and if it's not, then market failure arise, and we need effective policy to address this market failure. Therefore, the whole point of this presentation is we need a clear understanding of the economics of transitioning from circular from linear to a circular economy. And to summarize, circular economy is an important alternative to fix all the environmental and societal issues associated with the linear economic system, but the existing literature focus on method and processes. While they are necessary, it's not sufficient for the adoption of this of circular economy. And so we need an understanding of the economic impacts of circular economy. And we develop a framework that is general and scalable and adaptable with minor modifications specific to each supply chain. And we discuss some economic issues that arise and provide some policy discussion. And thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. We are going to now have a panel discussion, and I'll give the opportunity first to any online questions or anyone in the room who may have a thought before I will jump in with a few questions for the panel. Yeah, so if you have a question, do please feel free to make your way towards the mics that are in the center of the room here.
I can speak. Okay, I was working. Thank you so much. This is a lot of rich material to think about. I'd like your reflection on, if we look at the carbon flows, water flows, and energy flows, it becomes a little bit more complicated, but it becomes more real. What are your thoughts in looking at this circular economy from a water, energy, food system of flows that actually it has complexity, but it makes it a little bit more maybe feasible because of the energy that can be produced inside at the farm gate, but also looking at wastewater reuse and the water dimension of that. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly the goal. And I think when you saw Ahmed's flows and inputs and outputs, now we just got to quantify what are all those inputs and have values on them. And so I was trying to show you bits and pieces where I think we've looked at what are the CO2 equivalents of losses, but I didn't have all of the carbon and energy inputs for all of the. So I think you're exactly right. And yes, I think having that full picture, but it's going to take more than a slide, right? It's going to take a book to figure out what are all those inputs and quantify for the full energy picture, full nitrogen in forms, full phosphorus, water, so on. But I think that's exactly what we're starting, and it's going to look a lot more like Ahmed's flow than it is some of the simple lines that I have. The only other thing I would caution, though, is that a lot of people study one of those lines and one of those issues, and there's variation around every one of those lines. There's opportunities to improve on every one of those lines, and that's the type of variation we've got to start studying and look at improvements. It's the last thing I would say is that it's plausible that we could make an improvement in one of those circles with a negative or a positive impact on a subsequent product / byproduct waste stream. So it is very complex, it's very daunting, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, and I think that's the goal that at least we, I can only speak for us here at UNL, but that's our goal. And maybe, I'm a beef person, if that wasn't clear to you. Beef is probably the most complex one, but therefore we thought, let's start with the hardest first, because we think we can do that. Others want to make a comment? And obviously, I didn't touch on food waste, but that all, right? So there's an opportunity. I think that's what we're trying to do is tie it all together.
I think what's happening now is everyone is working at circular economy at a specific industry, but there are some ramification and strategic interdependence between different industries, and there are impacts that goes beyond that specific industry. So I think there is a need for a multidisciplinary research to where we have diverse researchers from different specific field. They come together and study the whole system.
Thank you for your question. And so, like Galen said, I was just showing one slice of the pie that we're looking at in the Manure Shed initiative, but it's certainly very much focused on interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, but also when thinking about the outcomes or the effects of these different types of manure shed management approaches, certainly looking at it from the angle of the nexus of water and energy and food. We're using LCA, like lifecycle analysis, but I have colleagues where I work who are more steeped in the water, energy, food nexus, like the cutting edge kind of stuff. But I will say the LCA is kind of how we're approaching it. Is that pretty common in Europe? Yeah, okay, great, yes.
All right, I'm gonna spin off that exact question. So Abby talked about how there's not a lot of uniformity in the research, and we're talking about how this is an interdisciplinary problem because you have ag and biosystems engineers doing XYZ, and then you have people in the field doing all of these other things. So how can we start the conversation around making all of our research methods uniform so that we're actually able to create a circular discussion where one person who studies the cow and studies all of the inputs and outputs can talk directly to the person who studies the corn and the anaerobic digestion and all of this stuff so that we can put the pieces together.
That's an excellent question. One thought I've had on that is almost, trying to figure out what metrics do need to be absolutely reported and to not accept those publications if they don't have some of those metrics involved. You could hold the journals to making sure that people are, or that researchers are applying some certain metrics, especially for comparison purposes, moving forward on some of these things. I think that's one way.
That's excellent, yeah. And I'll also say, I think that, a lot of us are lucky to be in this long-term agroecosystem research network, and I find that working across disciplinary boundaries and also industry boundaries, because we have a lot of stakeholders and customers that work closely with us, that's been hugely helpful for starting this conversation and kind of just getting all, even having a common lexicon and getting on the same page. So I think so Abby's idea of standardized metrics and a lexicon. I will say, we have 400 researchers in the network. We're constantly trying to write these lexicons and what everything means, but it's an important start to all have the same language on it.
I don't actually see that as a challenge with some of the engineering slash science, nutrients, form of flow, and I think we can come together even across different ag disciplines and so on. I actually think, but it's related and part of your question, I think the bigger challenge is that I just showed you I'm looking at nitrogen, greenhouse gas, and I think we can communicate across different production systems. It's when you start applying the socio-economic components to it is where that communication is not happening, or, well, I think it is with UNL, but I don't think that happens as big as it needs to. And that to me is a bigger issue than it is probably us getting together on what are the flows and what are the units and being consistent. It's probably now how do you apply any social concerns, policy concerns, or economics. But I think it's happening, it's starting to, it's the goal of multidisciplinary teams, but we're not there yet.
I think it goes back to our understanding of circular economy. There is no one, and there are so many understanding of circular economy. So there is a need for having a uniform definition of and understanding for circular economy. Then when it comes to specific industry, then adjust that understanding to a specific supply chain.
So I'm going to take the next question, which is a follow-up to what's been discussed here in the room. So we've been hearing about some of the challenges of talking across disciplines, across academic ideas, being able to communicate. What are some of the successes that are out there? Because there are some in the realms of communication, collaboration, and working across these disciplines.
That's so easy, I'm first. No, I think we've made tremendous progress, and we have become much, I mean, look at all of the breakthroughs and improvements and efficiencies. And yes, it's been segmented and maybe less integrated, but you hear people say we need to go back to the old days of integrated production systems. And in some ways, that's what we are advocating, but not with the technologies and approaches that they used to use. It's with new approaches and techniques, but in now integrated systems. So I think it's easy for us to today. I guess I was focused on what are the challenges and what are we going to have for. I look at challenges as great because it gives us an opportunity to offer solutions and fix things and figure things out and learn a lot in the process and train graduate students in the process. So I didn't focus at all on some of the positives, but we've made tremendous progress in productivities across the board, and we've also, though, challenged the system. I think it was this morning's session talking about what have been the expenses that we didn't necessarily focus on or quantify. And I think that's changing too, where now we're looking at more of what are the full expenses in terms of environmental concerns and water, and especially in that regard. So I certainly don't want anybody to think that we're not going to solve some of these things. I'm as optimistic we will have solutions. I just wanted to focus on what I think the challenges are today.
I can speak to just a kind of, I'll talk about the manure shed again. So in our work, understanding how producers are disposing of their surplus manure nutrients and kind of looking at it as either a liability or as a resource, there's a lot of already, and I'm sure you all know living in Nebraska or in different places, there's a lot of social networks around that really enable this type of recycling that's already happening. So there's a lot of backhauling. So for instance, I live in New Mexico. There's a lot of systems where folks are importing, are bringing hay into New Mexico, although we have a pretty good hay industry, but they'll bring hay in from Utah and then on that same truck, like backhaul manure nutrients to bring back to there. And there's like a big industry around that in Pennsylvania with the mushroom industry. And so, so we see, and this isn't exactly interdisciplinary research, but this is kind of working across industry borders and industry types, and so that's pretty heartening to me. I think where the academic piece comes in, or the research piece comes in, is trying to describe some of those systems, understanding, where it's happening, why it's not happening, and then bringing in, even in another sphere, the government efforts to incentivize those activities. So that was sort of off topic, wasn't it, Pat? Was that
Perfectly
all right?
fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, but that's a win, I think.
I would say in the food waste area, there's a lot more like consumer awareness of what people are doing now. Like I said, at this building, there is a place to put organic materials. There's a lot more like home composting that you can do, that really small things that you can just keep in your kitchen, and it does it really quickly. Now, they're really expensive, but they look super cool. But I think there's a lot more awareness now, and there's a lot more people that are looking for ways to reduce some of that food waste that is produced.
Thank you. Other questions in the room?
Can I ask just a small question on I like the term minutia, and immediately before I looked at the whole discussion we have, what came to mind is the area that farmers spread them around them, and could you talk about that, because this is a big challenge in terms of water quality,
Sure.
especially in the winter when you don't have the flexibility to go far away from the feeding lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the
So,
question.
go
sorry.
ahead. You have
No,
the question.
please,
Thank
Pat. Do it.
No, I was just going to repeat the question for those of you that are online. The question was talking about the manure sheds and the water quality within those manure sheds and how that is impacted by the distance from the feedlots.
Yes, so absolutely. So manure sheds certainly are mostly managed on the farm scale. So looking at even like the dairies near where I live, producing a lot of weight of manure and urine, and then that is just piped over just right next door onto the forage fields to grow hay, to grow alfalfa. So that's a manure shed. So that's really, so those folks have a lot of issues then. So they have somewhere to put the liquids, but then the solids become surplus, and they have to find ways to move that around. And where I'm living, a lot of the farmers are experiencing land use change, impacting their opportunities for moving that into croplands, because the crops are being converted into urban or ex-urban stuff. So that's sort of one scale of thinking about it. We've written a few papers on sort of the regional approach, where we see really major hotspots at the county level of manure surplus, but then thinking about the potential sink counties around it. And so that's also another scale that's sort of more aspirational. It takes a lot more coordination and vision, and just getting a lot of folks talking to each other, which is why the social science aspect piece and stakeholder engagement is becoming more important to actually actualize this stuff. And then what I talked about today was pretty pie in the sky, but really just thinking about the extensive nature of beef systems. So, but yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, so we're looking at it at all the scales, and they're all important. And what's interesting is on the farm scale, nutrient management plans really capture manure shed management on the farm scale, but those can change from state to state, it's seeming like quite a bit. So yeah, there's a rich sampling environment of things to learn about here and how it's all working. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about, that's sort of a follow-up on that. I'm in southeast Kansas, and Arkansas produces a lot of the poultry confinement. Oklahoma has already sued Arkansas for contamination of the waterways. Arkansas is now selling the poultry to Kansas, and Kansas is concerned that Oklahoma will sue Kansas.
Yes.
Policy is huge.
Yes.
You must include, and part of the problem we have as modelers, it depends on where we draw the circle.
Yes.
And with a circular bioeconomy, that includes everything. And that's the challenge, is how do we include the policy and the social aspects? Because it's a very different perspective.
It's so true, and thank you for that. That's an interesting example that we've been tracking. That was over, yeah. there's a river, and I can't remember but yeah, there's been like, yeah, movement back and forth, and there's some irony going on there. Yeah, but no, absolutely, scale is everything, and that's why I feel like it's even hard to start talking about any of this stuff without a map with a scale bar and figure out exactly where we're talking about. And with the manure shed management, you know, there's sort of there's social liabilities or social license to move the resources, because you're moving it from one place where it might be a problem, you think it's going to be a benefit somewhere else, but then it becomes somebody else's experience, which might be a problem. So no, scale is really, it's everything. Yeah, and it's key when modeling. So good point, thank you. And yeah, policies, yeah, and social networks are huge with this.
Any last questions within the room? If not, I'm going to ask the panel one last question, which is, in 10 years, how do we know we have moved the needle on circular bioeconomies?
Tala?
I think one of the main challenge is the lack of incentives to adopt circular economy. And as long as there is a need for an intervention, either through governments, through politics, to give actors the incentive to adopt circular economy. So once we see some, like for example in 2015, the European Union signed a directive called the Circular Economy Plan, and it has so many objectives, and one of the objectives was recycling. And now, in average, recycling is 60% in Europe. Some countries there is 90, but in average it's 60%. So we need how do you say it? Political will to introduce changes. That's what I want.
To me, one of the first things that will be is that everybody in this room has heard and maybe agrees with that beef is bad for the environment. It's a huge water user. It's a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions for the US and globally. Quit eating beef, solve our environmental concerns. So my job is to solve those challenges before you make that decision. So to answer your question, Pat, my viewpoint is have we made beef both in reality, but maybe just as importantly in perception, get a more accurate portrayal of the real impacts. I think circularity is one of those ways to tackle that issue. There are others, and they're being worked on. So that's my future view of the world, is that I think that actually beef is and can be harmonious with the climate the way I think we want to view it in 10 years, and that we've made improvements. I think it'll be viewed as a solution, and there's some exciting things coming that'll do that. Now, with that said, this will tie in with Sherry's concept of the manure shed. I'm actually going to increase the need and area and transportation and challenge for manure sheds, because I want more of it in that trapped in a form that is usable and beneficial for recycling. Right now, we put it off into the air, particularly from a nitrogen standpoint.
Yeah, so the European model is certainly one to look at. I think that there's consumer and customer awareness of circular economies over there, and it's again part of the lexicon and part of the language, as I understand, in some countries. But I think for us in the U.S., one indicator might be that eventually there is a clean market signal in the supermarket of products that brought to you by a circular economy, and those things, sell better and people understand what that is, and there's excitement around that. I think that that's going to be, that to me is an aspirational kind of outcome, or that would be an indicator of some success.
Yeah, the kind of easiest indicator I can think of would be how much electricity generation do we have from low quality carbon sources. So that includes the manures, the food waste, a lot of that agro wastes that are produced. How much of that can we take and make into electricity or something of higher value that can be easily measured?
And with that, I want to thank the panel for their wonderful insights, contributions to this conference. I want to thank the audience for their perseverance and input to the session. And I look forward to the future that we have together.